It is the bitter, freezing morning of December 9, 1945, and the ruined, utterly devastated landscape of post-war Germany lies buried beneath a thick, suffocating blanket of ash-colored snow. The deafening guns of the greatest military conflict in human history have been silent for months, but the political maneuvering, espionage, and treacherous backroom betrayals happening behind the newly falling geopolitical curtain are more cutthroat than ever. The man who crushed Adolf Hitler's elite panzer divisions, the warrior who survived point-blank sniper fire in North Africa and walked upright through terrifying artillery barrages during the invasion of Sicily, is about to face his final battle. This battle will not be fought with tanks or artillery. It will be fought on a quiet, icy road, and it will spark a furious, relentless 70-year historical debate. Before we completely rip open the classified files, the missing National Archives, and the explosive intelligence allegations surrounding the death of General George S. Patton, I need you to do something. If you want the raw, unfiltered, and deeply human truth behind the men who shaped our modern world, hit that subscribe button right now. We do not do sanitized, polite textbook summaries here. We look at the brutal intellectual and political warfare that happens behind closed doors when the fate of millions hangs in the balance. To understand why dark, persistent whispers of murder, espionage, and massive government conspiracy began swirling immediately after Patton drew his last breath in a Heidelberg hospital bed, you absolutely have to peel back the polished mythology of the man and intimately examine the incredibly dangerous political liability he had become by the winter of 1945. During the brutal combat phase of the Second World War, Patton was the ultimate, unparalleled weapon of the Allied forces. He was a brilliantly aggressive, completely unapologetic master of mobile armored warfare, who operated on the philosophy that relentless, unforgiving forward momentum was the only possible way to destroy an entrenched enemy. He famously pushed the United States Third Army faster and further across the blood-stained European continent than tacticians thought physically possible, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. He ended the war with his victorious tank treads resting firmly inside the borders of Czechoslovakia. But the deep tragic irony of George S. Patton's entire existence was that the same psychological traits that made him an unstoppable genius on the battlefield made him a nightmare for the politicians. His total lack of a diplomatic filter, his absolute refusal to compromise, and his fiercely black and white view of the world were perfect for war, but catastrophic for peace. Once the shooting stopped, the Supreme Allied Command, led by the highly diplomatic General Dwight D. Eisenhower, desperately needed careful tacticians, smooth diplomats, and patient administrators. They needed diplomats to navigate the incredibly tense geopolitical chessboard of the newly occupied German territories. They did not need a roaring, unpredictable warrior who treated civilian press conferences like active combat zones and viewed politics as a coward's game. Patton was quickly and reluctantly appointed as the military governor of Bavaria, a bureaucratic position he thoroughly despised, and for which his fiery temperament made him ill-suited. A man built entirely for war was suddenly trapped in a world of paperwork and endless diplomatic meetings. More importantly, he was furiously opposed to the official policies coming directly out of Washington regarding the incredibly harsh treatment of the defeated German population. Patton fundamentally believed that the aggressive denazification process, heavily championed by powerful political figures like Henry Morgenthau Jr., was a short-sighted and vindictive mistake. He believed it was destroying the infrastructure of society and breeding a deep, dangerous resentment that would lead to another global disaster. He was openly defiant, intentionally retaining former Nazi party members in key administrative roles because he believed they were the only individuals competent enough. When pressed by journalists, Patton made a catastrophic blunder. He stated that the Nazi SS meant no more in Germany than being a Democrat or a Republican in the United States. That single, spectacularly ill-advised comparison ignited a massive, fiery political storm back in America. It infuriated the public and the global press. It forced the hand of General Eisenhower, who had finally run out of patience for his old friend's endless blunders. Eisenhower officially relieved Patton of his prestigious command of the beloved Third Army, essentially banishing the great conqueror to a meaningless desk job. He was sent to command the 15th Army, whose only mandated task was to write a dull historical report on the military tactics used during the war. However, losing his command was not the primary reason that dark, shadowy elements within the intelligence community supposedly wanted him dead. It was what General Patton planned to do next, and who he planned to target, that made him the most dangerous man on the continent. General Patton harbored a deep, visceral, almost apocalyptic hatred and absolute distrust of America's supposed ally, the Soviet Union. Long before the term Cold War was coined, Patton saw the Soviet Red Army as a terrifying, barbaric, and highly aggressive totalitarian horde. He saw them actively swallowing half of Europe behind an impenetrable iron curtain of oppression and political terror. While political leaders in Washington and London tried to maintain a fragile, smiling alliance with Stalin, Patton was screaming at the top of his lungs. He believed that the Allied armies had made a catastrophic historical error by stopping their advance at the Elbe River. He firmly and loudly believed the U.S. military should immediately halt demobilization and actively rearm the millions of defeated German soldiers. He wanted to launch a massive, full-scale, unannounced invasion of the Soviet Union to drive the Red Army all the way back to the borders of Russia. I want you to pause and truly think about the terrifying magnitude of that proposition. Put yourself in the shoes of the American president. You have just ended the most destructive war in human history. Your economy is transitioning back to peace. Mothers want their sons home. And your most famous battlefield general is actively, publicly lobbying to instantly start World War III against a nuclear-ambitious superpower. Type the word threat in the comments right now if you think Patton had become a rogue danger to global survival. Or type the word patriot if you believe he was a visionary who saw the Soviet menace for what it truly was before anyone else. Your perspective on this defines exactly how you will view the sinister events that followed. His fiery rhetoric was not just the private grumbling of a bitter old man. It was a highly vocal, terrifyingly serious strategic proposal from a legendary commander who still wielded immense influence over the minds of the American military establishment and the combat troops on the ground. He famously stated that he had absolutely no particular desire to understand the Russians, except to ascertain exactly how much lead or iron it takes to completely kill them. For the newly established Truman administration, Patton was a terrifying wildcard, capable of single-handedly igniting a global inferno. Furthermore, Patton had made it chillingly clear to his family, his close friends, and his loyal military associates that he was fully planning to officially resign his prestigious commission in the United States military the absolute moment his boots touched American soil. Taking off the stars and the uniform would completely untie his political hands, bypass the strict military chain of command, and avoid the threat of a court-martial. He fully intended to go on a massive, highly publicized, unfiltered nationwide speaking tour across the United States, using his immense celebrity status to blow the whistle on what he passionately considered to be the cowardly, treasonous political concessions made by the Allied leadership that had effectively surrendered half of the globe to communist domination. By the bitter winter of 1945, Patton was effectively a highly decorated man, standing in a room completely filled with explosive gasoline, casually holding a lit match. It is a matter of undisputed historical record that his erratic behavior and deeply controversial political views had caused such a massive level of panic within the highest echelons of global power that both American military intelligence operatives and the terrifyingly efficient Soviet NKVD were actively tapping his private telephone lines, intercepting his mail, and closely monitoring his every single movement across the European theater. When you carefully view the seemingly mundane events of December 9th through the dark, paranoid lens of this incredibly volatile political context, the bizarre, illogical circumstances surrounding that fatal traffic accident begin to cast terrifying, deeply suspicious shadows that absolutely fuel the fires of modern conspiracy. In the backseat of a pristine, heavily armored 1938 Cadillac 75 staff car sits General George S. Patton, accompanied by his close friend and Chief of Staff, Major General Hobart Gay. The vehicle is being expertly navigated by a 19-year-old combat veteran named Private First Class Horace Woodring. They are heading down the icy stretches of Route N38 toward the northern outskirts of Mannheim for what is supposed to be a quiet pheasant hunting trip. The Cadillac idles patiently at a standard railway crossing, waiting for a slow-moving transport train to pass. As the heavy iron tracks finally clear, Woodring gently accelerates the powerful vehicle, cruising at a leisurely, entirely safe speed of barely 20 miles per hour. Ahead of them, seemingly stalled or waiting on the side of the icy, treacherous road, is a massive 2.5-ton United States Army GMC transport truck. As the Cadillac smoothly approaches the vehicle, the heavy transport truck suddenly, inexplicably, and violently veers hard to the left without using any turn signals, cutting directly across the icy tarmac and forming an impassable, towering wall of olive-drab steel directly in the path of the general's approaching staff car. Woodring frantically slams his foot onto the brakes, but the unforgiving physical laws of momentum and the slick surface of the winter road render evasive maneuvers absolutely impossible. The terrifying crunch of twisting metal and shattering glass shatters the quiet winter morning as the front end of the Cadillac buries itself violently into the heavy chassis of the transport truck. The collision itself is surprisingly low impact, the exact kind of mundane traffic accident that happens 1,000 times a day across the globe without any serious, life-altering consequence. Private Woodring walks away from the crumpled vehicle without a single scratch on his body. Major General Hobart Gay is entirely unhurt, merely shaken and disoriented by the sudden deceleration of the crash. But General George S. Patton, the seemingly immortal warrior, is violently, helplessly thrown forward by the kinetic force of the impact. His head strikes the solid metal and glass partition located directly behind the driver's seat with a sickening impact, peeling back a massive, bloody laceration that stretches horrifyingly from the bridge of his nose to the very top of his scalp. He collapses backward into the lap of General Gay, his body instantly, permanently, and terrifyingly paralyzed from the neck down, unable to move a single muscle in his limbs. Proponents of the assassination theory quickly point out that virtually nothing about the crash, the immediate aftermath, or the subsequent military investigation makes logical procedural sense for a standard incident involving one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States military. Let us intimately examine the deeply strange behavior of the driver of the heavy transport truck, Technical Sergeant Robert Thompson. According to the sworn, on-the-record statements of Private Horace Woodring and the military police officers who eventually arrived at the freezing scene, Thompson's behavior following the devastating collision was wildly inappropriate and completely devoid of the panic one would expect from a low-ranking soldier who had just crippled a legendary 4-star general. Despite having just caused a catastrophic collision, Thompson appeared entirely unconcerned, displaying a bizarre, constant grin, and acting in such an erratic manner that it led Woodring to vocally suspect that Thompson and his 2 unidentified companions were heavily under the influence of alcohol. More alarmingly, official military records later definitively showed that Thompson and his massive truck were completely off their designated route, operating more than 50 miles away from where they were officially supposed to be stationed, engaged in what the military vaguely and dismissively described as an unauthorized joyride. Yet, despite essentially commandeering heavy military equipment, severely violating routing protocols, and causing a catastrophic accident that literally broke the neck of a decorated commander, absolutely no formal charges were ever filed against Technical Sergeant Thompson by the military justice system. The military police conducted a shockingly brief, incredibly superficial investigation, casually classifying the catastrophic event as a routine fender bender caused by slick roads, and quietly letting everyone involved walk away without facing a single consequence or a court-martial. Furthermore, dedicated researchers, historians, and investigative journalists who have spent decades trying to untangle the bureaucratic mess and find the original source documents surrounding the accident have discovered a terrifying black hole precisely where the hard evidence should be carefully preserved. The official accident reports, the detailed sworn testimonies of the witnesses, the accident scene photographs, and the critical mechanical documents pertaining to the crash investigation have inexplicably vanished from the meticulously maintained National Archives in Washington, D.C. They are completely lost to history in a highly specific manner that strongly suggests deliberate, systematic suppression and destruction of evidence, rather than a simple clerical error. I want you to ask yourself, how does the United States government simply lose the primary investigation files regarding the fatal accident of its most famous wartime general? Type the word cover-up in the comments if you believe these files were intentionally destroyed to protect a dark secret, or type mismanagement if you think the chaotic post-war military bureaucracy simply misplaced the paperwork. Even the actual physical 1938 Cadillac in which Patton was riding became the subject of intense, enduring mystery. Persistent rumors began circulating that the heavily damaged vehicle currently on display at the Patton Museum at Fort Knox is a complete fraudulent fake. Automotive experts who have meticulously analyzed the museum piece have noted mismatched vehicle identification numbers and structural discrepancies that suggest the original car was quickly hidden away, secretly destroyed, or entirely replaced with a modified duplicate model to permanently prevent any independent forensic investigation into the exact nature of the damage. For those who passionately believe that a shadowy, powerful cabal of intelligence operatives was directly orchestrating Patton's demise, the truck crash was absolutely not a tragic, random accident. It was a highly coordinated, flawlessly executed, and brilliantly covered-up ambush designed specifically to look exactly like a tragic, random accident to the untrained eye. The deep, sprawling conspiracy theories aggressively follow the paralyzed, broken general directly into the sterile, heavily guarded rooms of the hospital in Heidelberg, where the narrative takes an even darker turn. Initially, upon his emergency admission, General Patton's medical prognosis was incredibly grim. His cervical vertebrae had been severely dislocated by the impact, completely severing his spinal cord's ability to transmit signals and leaving him with the absolute inability to move or feel anything below his neck. The world's absolute top medical specialists were immediately flown in on priority military transports to be at his bedside, expecting the legendary warrior to succumb to his catastrophic injuries within hours. Yet, displaying the exact same terrifying iron-willed stubbornness that had driven him to conquer Europe, Patton miraculously began to show entirely unexpected, highly encouraging signs of physical recovery. Within a week of the paralyzing crash, he was remarkably regaining some independent respiratory muscle movement. His volatile vital signs were stabilizing, his famously sharp mind was entirely clear, and the military medical staff were actively making the highly complex logistical preparations necessary to safely fly him across the Atlantic Ocean back to the United States for long-term rehabilitation. If the theoretical conspirators had truly staged the violent truck crash to permanently silence the rogue general, they had miserably failed in their mission. Now, Patton was about to return to American soil, physically paralyzed, but with his brilliant mind, his terrifyingly loud voice, and his explosive political platform completely intact. Then, on the evening of December 20th, the optimistic medical situation suddenly, violently, and inexplicably deteriorated without any prior warning. Patton began frantically struggling for breath, his skin turning pale as his respiratory condition rapidly worsened, and the following day, the great conqueror quietly died in his sleep. The official military medical certificate, signed by the attending physicians, listed the clinical cause of death as severe pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure, brought on directly by a massive blood clot. This is a remarkably common and entirely scientifically sound medical complication for an elderly man who has been rigidly immobilized in a hospital bed with a catastrophic spinal cord injury for over a week. However, the absolute, undeniable fuel that instantly ignited the enduring conspiracy of cold-blooded murder was the shocking, highly controversial revelation that no medical autopsy was ever performed on General George S. Patton's body to scientifically confirm the exact chemical cause of his sudden heart failure. Before anyone in his family or his loyal staff could demand an independent, thorough medical inquiry or explicitly request a comprehensive toxicology report to check for the presence of foreign, lethal substances in his bloodstream, Patton was swiftly placed in a military casket and permanently buried alongside his fallen soldiers in Luxembourg. For hardened conspiracy theorists and investigative researchers, this glaring, unprecedented lack of a formal autopsy on one of the most important military figures in human history is the ultimate smoking gun of a massive cover-up. They fiercely argue that the sudden, fatal deterioration in his hospital room was absolutely not caused by a natural blood clot traveling to his lungs, but by a highly trained, completely ruthless assassin. They theorize it was either a deep-cover Soviet NKVD infiltrator acting on the direct orders of Joseph Stalin, or an American intelligence operative acting on the highest, darkest orders from Washington, who seamlessly slipped into Patton's minimally guarded hospital room and directly administered a lethal, completely untraceable poison. This hypothetical injection flawlessly mimicked the exact physical symptoms of natural heart failure, thereby finishing the brutal job that the botched truck collision had started, permanently silencing the rogue general, and successfully preventing him from returning home to ignite a catastrophic Third World War. This incredibly dark, wildly speculative narrative of high-level espionage and international betrayal might have remained absolutely nothing more than a fringe, whispered rumor, if not for the explosive, highly publicized public confession of a man named Douglas Bazada. For nearly 30 long years following Patton's quiet burial, the specific idea of a coordinated assassination plot was almost entirely absent from the serious historical record, surfacing only briefly as the highly dramatized plot of a fictional thriller novel. But in 1979, the fragile, comforting line between entertaining Hollywood fiction and terrifying historical reality was utterly shattered. Bazada, a highly decorated, highly lethal former World War II operative for the Office of Strategic Services, stepped directly out of the historical shadows and publicly claimed to the global media that he had been the exact man officially ordered by the United States government to pull the trigger and execute the general. Bazada was absolutely not a random crackpot. He was a known, highly trained military operative who had spent the entire duration of the war conducting highly classified, dangerous sabotage and assassination missions deep behind enemy lines in occupied Europe, working directly under the personal command of legendary OSS director Major General William Donovan. According to Bazada's deeply detailed and highly controversial confession, General Donovan had secretly ordered him to assassinate General Patton because the rogue commander had become an absolute, uncontrollable threat to the delicate political stability of the free world. Bazada confidently outlined a complex assassination plot that sounded exactly like a script rejected by Hollywood executives for being far too unbelievable. He claimed that he had successfully infiltrated the heavily guarded military motor pool on the freezing morning of December 9th and deliberately jammed the window of Patton's heavy Cadillac open by exactly 4 inches, knowing that the freezing winter draft would force Patton to sit in a very specific, highly vulnerable position in the back seat. Bazada then claimed that he was actively hiding in the shadows near the railroad crossing when the heavy military transport truck intentionally rammed the staff car to create a chaotic diversion. In the terrifying split second of the actual collision, Bazada stated that he raised a highly classified, purely experimental custom-made weapon that silently fired a dense, untraceable projectile, shooting General Patton directly in the face through the strategically jammed open window. This supposedly snapped the general's neck with brutal kinetic force and made it appear to the terrified witnesses inside the car as though the catastrophic injury had been caused entirely by the physical trauma of the car crash itself. When this incredibly convoluted, insanely risky assassination attempt miraculously failed to actually kill the resilient old warrior on the spot, Bazada claimed that the top brass of the OSS simply shifted to their contingency plan, sending highly specialized, silent operatives directly into the Heidelberg hospital days later to finally finish Patton off, with a refined, completely untraceable poison that successfully induced the fatal pulmonary embolism. Yet, despite the incredibly seductive, thrilling, and cinematic narrative of a high-stakes international assassination plot involving experimental weapons, rogue intelligence spies, manipulated truck crashes, and poisoned hospital IV drips, the overwhelming consensus among serious mainstream military historians is that the vast conspiracy theories surrounding General Patton's death are absolutely nothing more than a collection of fabricated, entirely illogical fairy tales designed to sell books and movie tickets. When you carefully apply the cold, harsh light of logic, medical science, and actual historical evidence to the explosive claims of Douglas Bezada and the passionate proponents of the assassination theory, the entire dramatic narrative instantly collapses under the massive, crushing weight of its own logistical absurdity. First and foremost, any basic comparison of Bezada's incredibly complex story against the sworn, on-the-record eyewitness testimonies of Private Horace Woodring, Major General Hobart Gay, and the medical personnel who actually treated Patton at the bloody scene completely destroys the bizarre notion of a secret projectile-firing weapon. Neither Woodring nor Gay ever reported hearing a gunshot, seeing a projectile enter the vehicle, or observing any shattered glass that would indicate a weapon had been fired into the cab of the Cadillac. The deep laceration on Patton's forehead was entirely medically consistent with a man being violently thrown forward into a hard metal and glass partition, not a man who had just been shot directly in the face by a mysterious heavy weapon from the side of the road. Furthermore, the absolute core political motive behind the entire assassination theory completely ignores the established political reality of December 1945. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Truman administration, and the massive American political machine had already successfully, publicly, and thoroughly neutralized George S. Patton. By officially stripping him of his prestigious command, banishing him to a meaningless desk job, and publicly embarrassing him in the global press, the military hierarchy had already completely destroyed Patton's political credibility and permanently removed his hands from the actual levers of military power. He was an isolated, humiliated, deeply depressed general who was already scheduled to leave the European theater of operations and return home as a highly controversial figure, not a conquering hero. Ordering a highly complex, dangerous assassination plot involving staged military truck crashes and poisoned hospitals that could trigger a catastrophic, unprecedented political scandal would have been an incredibly reckless, mathematically stupid gamble for the United States government when simply letting the old soldier slowly fade away into civilian retirement was already working perfectly well. Finally, the stark medical reality of Patton's sudden death absolutely does not require the intervention of a shadowy Soviet assassin or a covert OSS poisoner to make logical, scientific sense. For a robust, highly active 60-year-old man who has spent his entire life in rigorous physical motion to suddenly suffer a catastrophic cervical spinal cord injury that completely immobilizes his body in a flat hospital bed for nearly 2 weeks, the rapid development of deep vein thrombosis is a near certain medical probability. When a massive blood clot inevitably forms in the stagnant blood of the immobilized legs, breaks free, travels directly through the bloodstream to the lungs, and causes a massive, fatal pulmonary embolism leading to immediate congestive heart failure, it is not a thrilling medical mystery ripped from the pages of a spy novel. It is a tragically common, highly expected, and entirely scientifically sound physiological outcome that sadly claims the lives of thousands of severely paralyzed hospital patients every single year across the globe. In the final, completely objective historical analysis, it is overwhelmingly and undeniably likely that General George S. Patton, a man who had brilliantly commanded hundreds of thousands of combat troops across the absolute bloodiest, most terrifying battlefields in human history, met his ultimate, inescapable end not in a massive blaze of battlefield glory or at the highly trained hands of a brilliant international intelligence conspiracy, but through a totally random, deeply meaningless, and entirely mundane chain of unfortunate traffic circumstances. He was simply tragically unlucky on a freezing, icy road in Mannheim, falling victim to the exact same careless automotive physics that claim ordinary lives every day. But human psychology, by its very evolutionary nature, fundamentally struggles and actively rebels against accepting the terrifying, chaotic, and entirely random nature of the universe. When a legendary man who seemed entirely invincible to thousands of enemy bullets and massive armored offensives is suddenly quietly killed by a low-speed, completely unremarkable fender bender on a quiet hunting trip, it feels inherently wrong to the human mind, almost deeply insulting to the grand, epic narrative of his incredibly violent and impactful life. We naturally desperately reach for the fantastic, the conspiratorial, and the sinister, because we simply cannot psychologically accept the deeply humbling reality that even the absolute most powerful, heavily armed men among us are ultimately subject to the chaotic, meaningless accidents of everyday, fragile human life. The enduring conspiracy theory that General George S. Patton was deliberately assassinated provides a deeply comforting, albeit dark, illusion of control and order. It suggests to the masses that a great, world-changing man was brought down by a great, highly organized plot orchestrated by powerful men in smoke-filled rooms, rather than forcing us to accept the devastating truth that he was killed by an exhausted, careless joyriding truck driver who simply forgot to check his mirrors before making a left turn. Until some intrepid researcher actually unearths concrete, verifiable physical evidence of deliberate foul play, the death of General George S. Patton must remain exactly what the immense weight of the official historical record proves it to be: a deeply tragic, heartbreaking, and entirely mundane accident that unceremoniously robbed the post-war world of one of its most brilliant, complicated, fiercely human, and undeniably controversial military minds. But history is rarely completely, permanently settled in the minds of the public, and the intense, furious debate over the dark final days of Old Blood and Guts continues to rage with unyielding passion across countless internet forums, best-selling history books, and gripping documentary films over 70 years after he was laid to rest. Having heard the incredibly explosive allegations of missing National Archives, strange grinning truck drivers, highly trained rogue OSS operatives, the terrifying threat of the Soviet NKVD, and the massive political pressure from the highest levels of the Allied government to permanently silence a rogue, unpredictable general before he could start World War III, the final, ultimate verdict on this massive historical mystery now falls entirely, squarely to you. Do you firmly believe that the official, sanitized historical record is a massive, highly successful cover-up designed specifically to hide the most explosive, world-altering political assassination of the 20th century? Or do you logically believe that the great, seemingly invincible General Patton simply ran out of luck on a freezing German highway on a quiet Sunday morning? I want you to dive directly into the comments section right now. Join this massive historical debate and cast your definitive vote on the ultimate fate of history's most brilliant, unapologetic warrior. I want you to type the word murder if you fiercely believe the crash was staged, the evidence was deliberately destroyed, and he was intentionally silenced by the deep state to protect the post-war geopolitical order. Conversely, I want you to type the word accident if you firmly believe the historical, medical, and scientific consensus that his death was absolutely nothing more than a tragic, incredibly mundane twist of fate that proves no man, no matter how great, is immortal. We actively read absolutely every single comment, and your intense, passionate engagement is the absolute only reason we can continue to rip down these stubborn historical walls and bring the raw, unfiltered truth of the past back to life. Leave your honest opinion, stay fiercely curious about the world around you, stay incredibly objective when analyzing the facts, and always remember that in the vast, twisting labyrinth of human history, the actual truth is almost always stranger, much darker, and infinitely more complicated than the polished, polite myths they print in the standard textbooks.